President Biden is going to speak with allies about the war in Ukraine, and Ukrainians have managed to thwart some of Russia's progress in its invasion despite Moscow's shelling campaigns. Holly Williams reports from West Kyiv, where people are resisting ground advancements.
From the air, Russia continues to rain death and destruction on this country. This school was hit by a Russian airstrike earlier this month, according to Ukrainian officials, though nobody was killed. But on the ground, Ukrainian forces are on the counter-offensive, while Russia is struggling to supply its troops with fuel and food, according to a senior U.S. defense official. This video appears to show a column of Russian military vehicles being lured into a trap in the town of Voznesensk earlier this month. Helping with the ambush was a shopkeeper, Alexander. "You little beauties," he shouts. Nearly a month after Russia invaded its neighbour, its ground forces have made surprisingly slow progress. Ukraine's military says it recaptured the town of Makariv on Monday, a key strategic gateway to the capital, Kyiv. And across Ukraine, ordinary people have mobilised to defend their homeland. At this checkpoint, we met Anatoly, a pig farmer. Okay, loaded. Armed with his own hunting rifle. He told us the biggest thing he ever shot before was a goat, but now he's ready to fight the Russians with an improvised bomb shelter dug out by the roadside. This is your protection from missiles and airstrikes. They've got tyre spikes and other obstacles to stop a Russian advance. These are to throw in the way of the tanks and disable them.
I'll show you.
And Vitaly, a greengrocer, showed us their homemade arsenal of Molotov cocktails. Would you be willing to give up some of Ukraine's territory for peace? It's impossible to give our territory away, he told us. I won't agree to anything else. Ukraine's fighting spirit is breathtaking. The ingenuity and bravery of its people extraordinary. But from the air, Russia is leaving carnage in its path. This hospital was decimated by a Russian missile strike on Monday, say Ukrainian officials, killing 3. And Russia has even deadlier weapons at its disposal. In an interview yesterday, the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov repeatedly refused to rule out using nuclear weapons if Russia faced a, quote, existential threat. Anne-Marie and Vlad.
All right, Holly, thank you. Well, Imtiaz Tayeb is continuing our coverage. He is in Lviv, in the western part of the country. You've been there all along. I want to talk a little bit about President Biden's visit to the area. He's going to Brussels. What is the expectation for this visit?
Emery Black, good to talk to you. Yeah. President Biden going to Brussels, and the key thing that he wants to focus on and indeed project to the world, and more specifically to Moscow, is unity. He wants to show Vladimir Putin that the U.S., NATO, the European Union, and really all of these countries are together and that they are standing in opposition to his invasion of Ukraine. Now, the president has a series of very high-profile meetings. He'll be meeting with the Group of Seven, he'll be meeting with NATO, and he'll also be meeting with senior figures within the European Union. Again, part of that real strong push for unity. But behind all of that, we're also likely going to hear another round of sanctions being imposed against Russia. But more importantly, I think we're going to hear a lot of talk of red lines. And what do I mean about red lines is, what are the red lines that the U.S., NATO, and its allies have when it comes to this war, and indeed Vladimir Putin's actions within this war? Some of those red lines, as we understand it, is cyber warfare, chemical or biological weapons, the use of, and of course, nuclear weapons. Nobody wants any of that to happen, of course. That, of course, is a very terrifying prospect, but it is something that needs to be considered. As we heard from Holly just now, Russia not ruling it out, in fact, dangling the prospect of some sort of nuclear conflict really from the beginning. So President Biden certainly has an awful lot on his plate in Brussels, but he will be coming close to here. I'm close to the border with Poland. He will be traveling to Poland, which, as we know, has embraced millions of Ukrainians fleeing from this conflict. Anne-Marie, Vlad.
Imtiaz, as you point out, the Russians have made it clear, or at least they've saber-rattled, that nothing is off the table when it comes to their existential being. And as you know, one Russian official even told Christiane Amanpour on another network that nuclear weapons are not off the table. But describe how this war has taken a toll on Russian forces. The Russians are not providing up-to-date numbers, so what we can glean comes from reporters like yourself and what the Ukrainians are telling us. But they are, I mean, we're seeing significant, heavy losses from the Russians. And I wonder, it's just so fascinating to me, away from the horror and the tragedy, the human aspect of this war. I mean, we don't even know which commanding general is in charge of this invasion. We have no understanding. I read a fascinating piece in the New York Times about how the Ukrainian Air Force is having some limited success against the Russian Air Force. They fly 200 sorties a day. The Ukrainians fly maybe 10 or 15, and yet they're still seeing successes. What is going on?
I mean, Vlad, you really hit the nail on the head with this one. I mean, in this war, in this modern warfare where you have TikTok, you have social media, you have the world's media, you have so many cameras trained on this war, and yet it's so opaque at the same time. And let's focus on Russia for a moment, because as you rightly point out, we don't actually know for sure who the leading general is. And more importantly, Russia hasn't really issued for weeks now the kind of the number of casualties that it's losing on the ground. According to U.S. intelligence officials, they put that number up to 6,000 or 7,000. 6,000 or 7,000 in fighting that's only lasted for around 4 weeks now. But again, we cannot say for certain because there is so much secrecy around this. But when you look at all those that imagery that we have, and that satellite imagery as well, you just look at these wrecked hulks of tanks, of Russian columns that haven't moved, and we're getting all of this information where we do hear that, you know, this kind of push into Kyiv, the capital city, has stalled now for weeks, and that we're hearing that Russian forces are not only running out of food, but they're running out of fuel, and perhaps more crucially, they're running out of morale. And that could perhaps explain why we haven't seen what many believe Vladimir Putin thought he was going to achieve, which was this lightning strike where he was going to seize the capital, and this conflict would have been done within a few days. That, of course, hasn't happened. We're now entering our second month of this war. But again, Vlad, to go back to your point about this kind of sense of opaqueness that we have here, you know, it's not just on the Russian side, it's also on the Ukrainian side. We don't have a lot of understanding as to the kind of losses they've had as well. But what we do know is that they have surprised everyone in how hard they've been able to fight back. They've surprised everyone in their resistance, and they've surprised, most crucially, Vladimir Putin, who again thought he could just roll in and take this country, which is something he has not been able to achieve just yet. Anne-Marie,
you know,
Vlad.
Imtiaz, you just raised a good point before we wrap this up. You know, how difficult is it for you on the ground and other reporters to accurately reflect what is happening in Ukraine from the Ukrainian perspective? Because as we've talked about, Anne-Marie and I, we also have to be careful that the information coming from the Ukrainian from Ukraine is accurate. There's certainly a sense that the whole world is standing with Ukraine, but you know, we've got to be a skeptic when it comes to some of the numbers and some of the things that they're saying.
Yeah. Absolutely. Look, we have to, right? I mean, the reality is that this is a sovereign nation that is being invaded, but more importantly, this is a sophisticated nation when it comes to messaging. President Zelensky, perhaps one of the most sophisticated communicators in the world, specifically when it comes to this conflict. And if you speak to Ukrainian officials, their numbers are much higher, and their ability to repel the Russians, which we've seen as evidently true, may be less successful than perhaps might meet the eye. And again, you're right, Vlad, we do have to weigh both sides, because at the end of the day, our jobs is to give you the best approximation of the information that we have as we get it. And that's constantly changing, and we also live in an era of misinformation, disinformation, and again, it's all of these layers that you have to filter through. But again, when it comes to the losses that Russia is experiencing, it's evident. We're seeing it on the ground, and we're also seeing its failure to kind of move forward in the way that many had expected. This huge military, this highly capable and well-armed military, to move faster, quicker, and harder than it has. And that is perhaps why we're seeing kind of the devastation in places like Kharkiv and Mariupol, which has largely been by airstrikes and other kinds of munitions working, but those ground forces seizing other parts of the territory not working. And again, for the Ukrainian side, very quickly, I just want to add, although we don't have any accurate figure of the kind of losses they have on the ground, what they do have in spades and what they do have sort of on a level that I don't think the Russians have is the motivation to fight, the determination to push out these invaders as they describe them, and that's what we're seeing on the ground here.
Yeah.
Vlad and Marie.
Very important details there. MTS Tayyab, thank you, my friend. Stay safe.